So it's really my pleasure at this juncture to introduce you to three people that you may know. And if you don't, you need to know. These individuals are leaders within the disability justice movement in Canada, and they are going to share their unique perspectives on the intersection of identities in the lives of people with episodic disabilities and disabilities in general. Our panelists are Lisa Arneson, Matthew Galina, and Rabia Kadir. Lisa is the founder and chair of the board of directors of Ashe Community Foundation for Black Canadians with Disabilities. Lisa is a successful and award-winning business owner, a senior administrator, and educator. Lisa's career spans over 30 years of enriched and transformative education and life experiences, delineating recognition for her distinctive expertise, including education and equity, and that includes anti-Black racism, disability rights, and accommodations. Her other areas of expertise includes governance, policy, strategic change management, and executive coaching. Matthew is the National Training Coordinator for the Indigenous Skills and Employment Training Program at the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, which we'll call CAP further along. He works diligently to assist urban off-reserve Indigenous peoples applying to CAP programs with successful skills training interventions and employment supports. Matthew is also working to provide specific support for his clientele living with disabilities. He represents CAP at the Canadian Association for Supported Employment Conference and at the Disability in Work Canada Conference. He was a project partner for CAP on the Harnessing Talent Alliance, on which he was my colleague since Realize was also a partner on that project. Rabia is dedicated to equity and justice for persons with disabilities, women, and diverse communities. She is the National Director of Disability Without Poverty and the Chief Executive Officer of Dean Support Services, a founder of Race and Disability Canada, which is such a critical organization to the disability movement here in Canada. She's also a board member of the Muslim Council of Peel and the Federation of Muslim Women. Rabia recently served as a director on the board of Accessibility Standards Canada, as a member of the Minister Carla Qualtrough's Disability Advisory Group, and previously served as a commissioner for the Ontario Human Rights Commission. A motivational speaker and a documentary commentator, Rabia has campaigned in municipal elections to serve as a city councillor in Mississauga. And Rabia, we hope you keep campaigning. We need you there. And she has received numerous awards for her humanitarian services, including a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Welcome, Lisa, Matthew, and Rabia. So the format for the panel will be as follows. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to speak. At the 3-minute mark, I will turn my camera on and show you the countdown clock. And for you, Rabia, I will give a verbal 3-minute alert, then a wrap-up verbal alert. Lisa, we'll start with you, then straight on to Matthew, and then last but by no means least, over to you, Rabia. So Lisa, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And it is an honor to be on this panel with Matthew and Rabia. The work, as Jada has clearly outlined, is quite difficult and challenging, and in some cases can be quite isolating. But when Realize and organizations like yourselves and others, like all of ours, come together to join our thoughts and ideas and move our movement forward, that's where the hope comes from. So let me introduce myself. On the screen is a capacity building research project picture, a photo that we used for our advertising for our research project we're doing right now. I am the chair of Ashe Community Foundation for Black Canadians with Disabilities. The word Ashe is a Yoruba word, which is a Nigerian language that means, so you say, so it will be. It's like an affirmation, the idea of manifesting something into existence. And I wanted to say a big shout out to everyone here who has joined this 3-day activity. Sorry. Before I go on, let me describe who I am. I'm a light-skinned, Black disabled woman. My disabilities are mainly physical, but I do have chronic illness that sometimes shows up physically. Currently, the sound and the voice that you're hearing is someone who has been sick, and sick because the first time after years I went for dinner with a friend, and she invited her friend, a Toronto School Board teacher, and she was not vaccinated somehow. And here we are, on to my second week of still being sick. So thank you for pointing those out, Jada. It's critical that people understand and respect that there are other types of disabilities, and chronic illness and autoimmune problems are real and have the effect on people. So I have 10 minutes to walk you through who we are. And specifically, I want to talk about numbers, data, and research. So the Ashe community is a national wayfinding and advocacy organization. We are not a service organization. We're an organization that's very much interested in policy, research, and the discussions of the intersectionality of race, gender, sexuality, gender identity, Blackness, etc. So we build on the foundations of the overwhelming strengths that are embodied by Black peoples with disabilities within the Pan-African diaspora. We are on a journey to shift culture to drive a culture shift that embraces the boundless talents and qualifications of people with disabilities and facilitates the full participation of all Black community members. And so it, again, tags right off of what Jada said in her first presentation. Our strategic priorities are education awareness, a community hub and app, which is culturally appropriate and provides an avenue, a network, so persons who are disability can take charge of accessing the information, the resources, and the assistance they need as when they need it. Collective platform for knowledge sharing and cross-organizational partnerships, research and policy development, and youth and student initiatives. So our vision is embodying an intersectional approach. It's grounded in disability justice, Black feminist theory, and critical race theory, actually more along the lines of of decolonization. We envision identifying gaps, building capacity, and advancing the overall well-being, economic engagement, and full participation of all Black Canadians and Black Canadians with disabilities. We are committed to working collectively across community members, community organizations, service providers, policymakers, researchers, government institutions, allies, and anyone that wants us to join their journey and wants to be a part of ours. Our research and policy, which is what I want to speak about today, is entirely rooted in the for us, by us ideas, which has existed for hundreds of years in our communities. And we continue that narrative and that honoring our ancestors. So collective research centering the lived experiences of Black Canadians with disabilities who tend to be underrepresented and underserved across all sectors of society. Our research strategy elevates the voices of those individuals and the intersectional experiences of our community through an intersectional, community engaged, and participatory approach. Our aim is to create this hub of Canadian-based research that does focus on Black Canadians with disabilities and racialized Canadians with disabilities. We want to address these significant gaps in race and disability in the data, and specifically look at Blackness, because there are some data on ethnicity or culture, or maybe a little bit on BIPOC, but actually the experience of Black people within that bigger arena is very, very specific and linked to the experience of the dehumanization of Black people through colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Collectively strengthen and analyze data to inform policies, funding, criteria, research, and services. Community-centered knowledge production. So we are grounded in the idea that our knowledge production is for us and by us, which elevates and cultivates research skills within our own communities, which is again in line with what Jada had commented about building. Share knowledge, practice, and findings through networks and partnerships, practitioners, faculty, and researchers of all people across Canada, and disrupt mainstream discourse, increase scholarship, and create knowledge that's based on us and who we are as racialized and Black folk with disabilities. So we started 2 years ago. We started before this, but we officially became incorporated. And we started with an environmental audit called the Intersection of Blackness and Disability. And really the audit became intersection of race and disability, as because many of you may know, the work that Rabia has been doing for years has been very much one of the singular works on race and disability in Canada with her collection of colleagues and community. And so finding work specifically about race and specifically about Blackness is very, very difficult and is one of our challenges in raising these issues and getting the resources we need to move our movements forward. So we know through our research, our environmental scan 2 years ago through Janelle, we're going to talk about Janelle Anderson in a moment, 3.4 Canadians identify as Black, 52 reside in Ontario. But there is a disproportionate outcomes for chronic illnesses within the Black community, and within being vulnerable for employment, issues with employment. Our findings are found through meetings that we have, town halls that we've held. And one of the quotes we want to talk about is, "This is the first time I have been in a space focused on sharing my experience as a Black person with disability." That's from our first town hall, Voices of Blackness and Disability. We also had a town hall just recently on Blackness and disability and capacity building. And again, the Director General of Employment and Social Development commented that Black persons with disabilities are one of the most vulnerable populations in Canada right now, and actually the lowest in employment. So these town halls, these opportunities for others to share and grow is part of the initial things that we're interested in. Partnerships and networks, we have a dire need for consolidated resources in this area. Youth Voices, Black Student Summit, a Success Summit, and a Student Network we've been working on for a year. We've done the Student Summit and we'll be returning again at the end of the year, at the end of August. And this is looking at all of the things students with disabilities need across Canada and working with other organizations that do this. And inaccessible grant processes is one of the things I'm working on this year. There are limited funding available for accommodations in general. So all of us know that many of us are committed to eradicating ableism, racism, transphobia, and all the other harms and traumas in our society that cause us to be excluded from spaces. But we also need accommodations in ourselves as leaders of people starting grassroots organizations to be who we are. We need additional grant supports for grassroots organizations. We need to have grants specifically for organizations that have and house leaders themselves who are themselves persons with disability, racialized, coming from other communities in the two-spirited LGBT communities. We want to see a specific effort on that. So we are currently working on a capacity building research project called The Intersection of Race and Disability. The survey is live. Janelle Anderson isn't here today to be on this panel, but she is the lead researcher. I'm the lead project manager. And the idea behind this research is it is a Canadian-wide environmental scan to identify and empower organizations and programs who are using an intersectional approach to race and disability. And the purpose is to understand those needs and barriers faced by organizations serving this population, identify resources, best practices, and challenges, and to create a network community of practice among organizations across Canada serving these populations. And of course, is to address these gaps within data and an engagement strategy for capacity building, which I will be submitting in June.
Lisa, I'm so sorry, but we'll have to ask you to wrap up so that we can
Oh,
move
I'm
to the
almost
next
wrapped
speaker.
up. Almost wrapped up.
Okay, great.
Project benefits is the awareness, the capacity building I previously talked about. We want to influence policy and change, and self-determination. This is putting it back in the hands of racialized and Black people with disabilities and being ahead of these research, not just being researched like a petri dish. This is our timelines. We have till almost the end of April for the surveys to be completed. This is the process, the surveys, the focus groups and one-on-ones, and I will be putting the links in the chat. And the study outcomes is everything I already said at the very, very beginning, and this is a conclusion of that. And we want you to share your challenges as well, because we found through our findings is that there isn't a lot of organizations that are focused on race and disability, or are organizations doing their work and have specific programming and initiatives. So if you are not at the moment doing it, but you're interested, we do have a focus group just for those. There's a part of the survey that you can complete for organizations interested in doing this work with us and with the government, and of course, one-on-ones. And we have an Embodying IS Symposium, Uniting Blackness, Disability, and Gender, coming in June during the Accessibility Week for the federal government. And I want to thank everyone for allowing me to talk about what we do, who we are, why it's important, and the research project.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I could hear you speak for the whole day. Thanks, Amel. And so now we're on to Matthew. Please stick around for questions. I know there'll be questions. Matthew, over to you, and then we'll have Rabia.
I just want to say, first of all, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. It was very informative, and I want to pass on that survey to my colleagues and distribute it through my network as well. To everyone else, Chimigwich. My name is Matthew Galena. I come to you today from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin by way of Treaty 10 in Northwest Saskatchewan, the Athabasca Dene. So for those of you that are living past Manitoba, I say, because it is still morning, I do say Dukapinazol. Thank you very much for attending this session today. I'm here to talk about the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. It is a national Indigenous organization that I've worked for almost 5 years. As a training coordinator, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples serves non-status members that are status but are living off reserve in urban areas, Métis that are not supported by the Métis National Council, which are primarily Métis east of Ontario, and the Southern Inuit of Labrador. The ISEP program, or the Indigenous Skills Employment Training Program, is federally funded by Employment Social Development Canada, and there are 110 agreement holders across Canada, and I'm not going to brag, but I know every single one of them. I mean, I don't call myself the national training coordinator just because it looks good on a business card, right? They don't teach any of this in schools and put in universities, so it took me almost a year and a half, but I was able to build a national map of where the funding agencies and eligibility criteria are. So if someone calls the office, my office, looking for funding for any program, I'm able to direct them to the appropriate service provider. Um, of the 110 ISET agreement holders, there are only 2 national, and the Congress of Aboriginal People is a national agreement holder. And what the ISET does is it provides funding for certificate programs, diploma programs, the final year of a degree program, as well as other employment supports like personal protective equipment and non-funded employment supports like resume workshops, mock job interviews, and such. The real difference is the non-status, which I alluded to earlier. And I'm not sure if anyone here is aware, but the non-status are the biggest percentage of CAP, primarily because in Canada, over 3/4, so about almost, actually approximately 80% of all Indigenous people live off reserve in Canada, but they get 20% of the federal services and supports. Now, the non-status, they're people that have Aboriginal ancestry, but they're unable to get a status card from Indigenous Services Canada for a multitude of reasons, either intermarriage or 60 scoop, which is when during the 60s, forcibly adoption of Indigenous children, Métis children, brought into non-Indigenous families to eradicate that culture. Bill C-31, Bill C-3, those are all examples of the barriers that our constituents face in getting a status card through the Indian Act for Indigenous Services Canada. And CAP advocates on their behalf. And the main way we advocate for ISET department is for skills training. What I noticed is when I was reviewing applications, under the sections where you had to identify you had a disability, many of our constituents did not enter that they had a disability, but they, in their essay, they made it clear that they were living with visible and invisible disabilities. They weren't sure exactly what it was. They weren't sure about the supports that were available to them. So I made it my goal to go to my director and go up the chain and create the disability and employment file at the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples and to head it up to provide more additional specific target supports to our members that need that in order for their skills training and future employment path, such as adaptive technologies, additional transportation, and tutoring services. So, basically, it's not one size fits all. It's case by case basis, and I was able to connect with different regional, national disability providers, Tammy being one of the main ones that I connected with at Realize. And thank you for the countdown clock, Tammy. I'm going to be bold to say that that's just for me because you know as well that I love to talk and I can talk all afternoon. So, but it was with Tammy that I really started to learn about what episodic disabilities were. And I was able, with this knowledge, I was able to bring it back to our board of directors and take it to our communities to find, and we helped someone that was living with endometriosis get additional supports that she needs that weren't part of our contribution agreement, but that wasn't a barrier that was going to stop her from getting her career path as a licensed practical nurse. And she did get an employment result because of that. And this knowledge, it was what I took towards other national and regional projects. The one that Tammy mentioned, the Harnessing Talent Alliance for recruiting and retaining employees with disabilities. And I met a couple employers along the way. And what we started to notice is that the human resources aspect of employment, there's a merge between cultural awareness training and modification and accommodations for disabilities. So I made it my goal with my colleagues that when we're trying to create partnerships and pathways for employment for our constituents, we make it clear that episodic disabilities have accommodation, but also the invisible disabilities, such as intergenerational trauma from residential schools, that there are adequate supports in the workplace for that, be it elder supports or smudging circles, to create a conducive atmosphere for employment that will benefit both the employer and employee. What I also want to touch on today is, and this goes back to what Liza was saying earlier about the importance of research. Through my own research, I was able to put together a proposal for, and CAP has been awarded of funding for a project, the Rebuilding Our Nations Through Accessibilities project, which the goal, this was pre-COVID, the goal was to serve as a shadow report for the government of Canada's official report to United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled Peoples. And we want to bring it from a non-status perspective, people that do not have multiple reports written about them because researchers are not, they're going to reserves, they're not going to gather information, they're not going to urban centers, they're not going to remote areas. They see Aboriginal and Indigenous and they think that you have to have a card, but they completely ignore the importance of self-identification. This is the audience that we tried to speak through for our project. It unfortunately had to get retooled due to the pandemic because we're doing a lot of focus groups. But we found that shifting to virtual was not good for our constituents that were living in rural, remote areas, as well as families that didn't have the connectivity for the internet that the focus group provides. So now that mandates are lifting and we are able to get to back to some sort of pre-COVID normalcy, we will be once again relaunching that project, and I can make everyone that's participating today more aware about the goals. But we want to do it in a way that reflects the purpose of this summit and talking about conducive employment to the workforce and the continuation of a work-life balance. This is not only for us at the office, but this is also for the workplaces, that for the employers that we partner with as well. We recognize the importance of a flexible hybrid work model that allows that allows the support of families during the pandemic without let's face it, let's be honest here. We would rather be leaving work early, not being stuck in the traffic, and spending time with our children instead. This is something that I'm going to try to champion in this project. And this is an opportunity that I feel that CAP is going to take advantage of in a post-pandemic labor market. That's
Matthew,
all I really have
sorry
to
to
say.
cross you as well. Okay, no, go
I
ahead
was
if you're wrapping up. Okay.
the buzzer's sounding. So I want to thank everyone for listening today. Merci Cho, Chimigwich, and I will put my LinkedIn in the chat for anyone that wants to connect further.
Jimmy Gwitch, Matthew. And yes, I can hear you speak for the whole day as well. Happy to listen to you, Lisa, and Rabia speak for the whole day. So now, Rabia, it's over to you.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm sitting in Mississauga, Ontario, the traditional territories, most recently of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and I am absolutely grateful to the ancestors, the original inhabitants and trustees of this land that I call home. I appreciate the sharing and caring nature of our Indigenous brothers and sisters who have allowed us to settle on this land that we consider home. My name is Rabia Khidr. I identify myself as a hyphen with many hijabs. I am a Muslim, Punjabi, Pakistani, Canadian woman, wife, mother, activist, advocate, sibling of individuals with disabilities, daughter of aging parents, all around, there's newer, more dignified terms that I've started to use, social entrepreneur and systems disruptor, and I happen to be blind. I have a disability. I am, so, when I've labeled myself in this way with my hyphenated identity, I've also suggested that that I've indicated that I wear a hijab, which is, for those of you who cannot see me on the screen, is a Muslim headdress, basically a scarf in any and many colors and patterns and textures that women choose to wear in order to express their spirituality and their identity. And this is a part of my identity journey as a Canadian, going through, discovering who I am individually and spiritually. I am a brown-skinned woman and a mother of 4 young adults as well. I'm the CEO of Dean Support Services, the founder of Race and Disability Canada, and the National Director of Disability Without Poverty. I appreciate being a part of this fantastic panel. I hope everyone can access this presentation with all the accessibility features that there are, and I hope that I am speaking at a reasonable and clear pace for everyone to follow my conversation that I'm having here. And it will be a conversation because you will ask me some questions. So, Liza, thank you so much for recognizing the work around race and disability. It's not all attributed to me. It's a journey that I have been a part of with a number of people at the grassroots level for several decades now. So once upon a time, a little long ago, mid-90s or so, I met a mentor who became a friend, Rafia Hanif Cleophas, and got introduced to ERDCO, Ethno-Racial People with Disabilities Coalition of Ontario. And I will share ERDCO's founding story. ERDCO's founding story went something like this. A group of friends gathered in Toronto around Nathan Phillips Square after work and shared their lived experience. They were all racialized from different backgrounds, different faith communities, different types of disability experiences. One day when they came together, one of the friends said, "I just lost my job." And they said, "What happened?" And she explained that she was verbally harassed, sexually harassed, ridiculed, not accommodated when she requested accommodation on the grounds of her disability and on the grounds of her faith. She was mocked and forced out eventually. Now they said, "Hey, friend, this is Canada. Sister, you gotta go, you gotta fight this battle. You gotta go find people out there, organizations that will help you. Go to organization ABC that deals with the legal issues of people with disabilities. And she went to organization ABC, and they said, well, this isn't really a legal issue. It's actually, a cultural issue. So please go to one of those cultural organizations. She came from the Caribbean. She was perceived as South Asian. So she was sent to a South Asian organization. They welcomed her with open arms and, offered her tea and samosas and all that kind of comfort familiar to the culture, and said, but this isn't the cultural issue. This is because you're a woman. She went to the women's organization and they said, this is a labor issue. She went to the labor organization, they said it's a disability issue. Everybody passed the buck on her. And she shared this story with her group of friends. And they realized that this was about the whole human being, not just the disabled person, not just the racialized person, not just the woman, not just, a Hindu worshiper. This was in fact about the whole deal, all these layers of her identity that intersected and informed her lived experience. She was discriminated on all these grounds, and nobody was ready to take it on. Too complex. So ERDCO started looking at intersectionality, and it wasn't known as intersectionality, but ERDCO pioneered its research. We are visible, including us. These were research, grassroots, community-based action research initiatives published in the 90s. Fast forward, my involvement, getting out there, doing stuff. I did stuff within the Muslim community because I felt that's where I could have impact. Because ERDCO, we tried, and we weren't getting the funding and resources, and no dominant organization wanted to share the pie. And nobody was giving us that helping hand to learn the ropes. As newcomer immigrant communities, I grew up here and I didn't know the system, because we weren't a part of the system. My parents were not a part of the system. I thought I knew it, but I did not know how to navigate it and manipulate it to get the resources I needed to do this critical work. Some time went by, we formed Canadian Association of Muslims with Disabilities and Dean Support Services. I did some national work where I felt that, again, race and disability was not reflected over 20 years ago. I left that movement and worked on the ground. Around 2016 or so, it was time to re-engage nationally, and I reached out. I went out and attended a round table on culture and disability with no diverse cultural communities. I was the token one. I came back and I talked to my friends at the Organization for Canadian Tamils with Disabilities, ATI Foundation, ERDCO, another mentor and late mentor and friend of mine, Sandra Carpenter with Center for Independent Living Toronto, South Asians Supporting Independent Living, Accessibility for All, and of course my friends at Dean and CAMT, the organizations that I founded with some other friends. And I said, it's time to do something about this. This isn't good enough. And we formed Race and Disability Canada. As Race and Disability Canada, we have been able to provide advice and input and advocate and force, at least at the federal level, the conversation on intersectionality. And now we're seeing it trickle in to funding opportunities and stuff. And I'm so glad that, Ashay has benefited and has gained some capacity to be able to do this critical research specifically on Black Canadians with disabilities as a part of racialized communities. Now, I know that Tammy's gonna give me that warning. So I really have so much to say and I need to babble, and I'm just babbling it all in here the best I can, and open to any questions and further conversations arising from this. So where are we at? Where we're at is it's time to share. It's time to collaborate. It's time to build capacity. We have to come together. We cannot divide ourselves as racialized people with disabilities. We cannot divide ourselves on the basis of types of disabilities, whether temporary or permanent, episodic or long-term, visible or invisible. Disability is disability that impacts our daily living. It doesn't matter what the definition or the label exactly is. If it impacts our lives and our livelihoods, we have the right to have the supports we need. Now, most people with disabilities live in poverty. They're underemployed or unemployed. Every person with a disability desires to work. Where the supports and services we have available to us force us to fit into boxes, compartmentalize us. All people with disabilities cannot access supportive housing. You have to have a certain label. All people with disabilities cannot access self-direct funding to manage their daily supports. Only people with physical disabilities can, for example. All people cannot access passport funding. Only people with intellectual disabilities who are over 18 potentially can. Divide and conquer.
Just giving you my 3-minute warning.
Okay, divide and conquer is the strategy of governments to keep us at bay so we don't ask too much and so that they can manage the budgets. Our vote doesn't necessarily count because we're not seen as a voting bloc. We continue to struggle financially and in terms of the programs and services we need, in terms of the housing supports we need. The list is endless of the struggle of people with disabilities and further struggle of racialized people with disabilities. COVID has adversely impacted racialized people and racialized people with disabilities unimaginably. We again catered to accommodating able-bodied people. We did not look at the impact of emergency measures and restrictions and recovery on people with disabilities and racialized people with disabilities. Long COVID remains to be seen in terms of what kind of impact, again, disproportionate impact is going to happen on racialized people with disabilities. Our leadership is critical, our voice is critical to making the change we wish to see in our future as we recover as a society. For me, the work I'm doing with Disability Without Poverty is critical to this recovery. A Canada Disability Benefit is essential to lifting people with disabilities to the poverty line because the disability poverty line is even higher. We need to stand up, we need to speak, shout, gesture, make noise so that we are heard in policy formation. We need to ask the question, where's the bill? Because if the Canada Disability Benefit becomes law and people with disabilities qualify for a top-up on their provincial incomes, et cetera, this will have a profound impact on their daily living, on the barriers that they face. It will be a positive step and a giant leap toward a better quality of life for everybody. If we support the voices of racialized people with disabilities, we impact greater accessibility and inclusion. Let's not divide, let's unite. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabia. And I don't know about everybody else, but I have goosebumps listening to Lisa, listening to Matthew, listening to Rabia. So we have 5 minutes for a very quick Q&A session. Danielle, perhaps I could also loop Jade in. Jade, if you're still with us, please feel free to turn your camera on. Okay, I'm seeing you. One of the first questions that I'll just throw out as we wait for any questions in the chat. Danielle asked, and anyone can respond to this, how can employers take some of the burden off of people with disabilities who are often tired of having to self-advocate for accessibility accommodations. And of course, we know that's even triply layered when we're speaking to further marginalized groups. So how can employers take some of the burden away from folks? Jade?
Okay, so I'm happy to jump in. I was going to see if one of the panelists wanted to go before me, but and thank you for that wonderful panel. It was great to be watching in the background. But one of the things that we're doing is we are creating an accessibility action plan that looks at every section of our organization in terms of like how we interact internally as well as externally, and really from the perspective that we like should not have to ask. Like there is no reason why accommodation has to be a thing other than the fact that there is problems in terms of how inclusive and welcoming an environment you are. And so what we're doing is we're working with Odland, which is a really great Ontario-based organization, disability organization, and queer organization. And we really are trying to focus on every area. So making sure we have checklists. So when people apply for positions, they have a checklist of potential things that say, we have all of these things in place. Every interview, we start with a accessibility check-in. We're making sure all of our staff are trained so that they do things right, and also putting the responsibility on supervisors. So if you are supervising staff, doing a quarterly check-in to say, are there any needs that is there anything that would make your job easier, make your work easier, that we could provide? And really try and create that space for those check-ins, because sometimes as disabled people, we're scared to ask, right? Because we've been told so often no. And so having that space where you're not just expecting it on behalf of the individual to come forward, but instead expecting it from the organization and from people who are in supervisory roles to be responsible for that, and actually make it an area of their accountability when it comes to their performance review, if there's performance reviews, because there's problems with those as a system. But if you're supervising people, that has to be one of your accountabilities. How much belonging have you created within your team? How have you done it? How have you removed as many barriers as you can?
Well said, Jade. And that hops back to some of what we covered and discussed yesterday around a culture of accommodation, from the hiring process to straight throughout every fabric of the organization, creating a culture of accommodation. Thanks so much. Lisa, I saw you had your hand up as a response. We have time for one more question after that, and then we'll go on to the break. Lisa, go ahead.
Notice that none of us are very short-winded. I'll make it quick. As a manager that has been doing this work in educational institutions for a long time, you want to know how simple this is? For Ashay, we give the questions before advance to everybody. So simple. We don't have to have people ask or have to check off what they want. We give it to everybody. We give a timeline to everybody, so that the culture is accessible. The culture is accessible for anybody. So you don't have to come and identify for us what you have. Oh, if you need more time, if you need this, it is built in. So there's no cutoff for a question. There's different ways. Send in a video, send in your portfolio. There are so many different ways that people can engage in an employment process that has nothing to do with us asking them what their accommodations are. So for me, I know it's very radical, and I know I spent 30 years in university institutions, so you can see I'm pretty radical, but let's just start with what we would want and just give it to everybody else. So simple.
Lisa, thanks so much. Sometimes the simplest things are the most radical. Look at what we've all lived through with COVID and that transition to hybrid work or work from home. Okay, so one more question. We're going to the break, and I think I have a question in the chat. How can you move all of these plans of action if the government is now prioritizing help and assistance for people in Ukraine who were affected by the war with Russia? I think, thank you for sharing that question, but from an organizational perspective, from a realized perspective, and I think from a justice movement perspective, there's enough love, there's enough that all of these things can be prioritized. There is enough. So thank you for asking that question. Matthew, did you want to comment or?
I was
Can
just
I
going to
jump in on
say,
that?
yeah, go ahead, Rabia.
So,
Sorry,
Great
I was trying to
presentation, by the
gesture. I
way.
don't know how to put up my hand.
no problem. Go ahead, Rabia. Then we'll have
Okay.
Matthew, and then we have to go on to the break. We have to go to stretch and dance and stuff. So, Rabia, over to you.
Thank you. We know that attention's being focused on what's happening in Ukraine, and government resources are going toward that. But we're in a democratic system in which we have voice and we have rights. So we keep advocating, we keep pushing. They keep, we hold our government accountable to their promises and raising the issues before them of any gaps. We keep advocating. We feel that as long as we express a united voice, as long as we speak loud and clear and a similar language, we are heard. So for the Canada Disability Benefit, for example, yes, some of us are thinking, oh, it might be shoved aside now that Ukraine is the priority, or the truckers convoy stuff happened, that's distracting, or whatever. No, if we have champions within and we back up those champions and we mobilize, and we popularize the cause, government still has to listen. They have to multitask. They're not focused on a single task only, and we cannot allow them to be. They have to look at what's happening within the country and their duty to support marginalized communities, vulnerable people. The state has a duty to uphold charter rights of every Canadian before they respond to global efforts. So yes, they're responding to global need because there are Ukrainian Canadians that are also advocating for that. And we have a duty globally to foster peace and protect democracy. But we are also a democracy that thrives on the efforts of its citizens advocating for programs and services. And as COVID evolves and we arise out of this pandemic, we want a better tomorrow, and we're demanding that better tomorrow. That's why it's fundamental that we don't give up. We continue the dialogue, we continue the conversation, we continue the advocacy efforts, because they will respond to the need as long as they know the extent of the need and the fact that the bottom line depends on it. And the bottom line for politicians ain't their pocketbooks, it's their votes.
Thanks so much, Rabia. Matthew, we're going to have your comment or your question in the chat. We need to stretch. I need to stretch, and I'm sure everybody needs to stretch. So we're going to have a 5-minute break. Thank you, Jade. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Rabia. I think we have a taste of a continuing conversation here.